On Information Technology and the Subcommittee on National Security will come to order. And without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. We expect to be interrupted by a vote series later this afternoon. And because of that, we're going to be abbreviated in some of our opening statements. I appreciate y'all being here today. Cybersecurity isn't a buzzword anymore. It's real. And y'all's written statements were helpful in helping me better understand this issue. And if we're able to get a whole of government talking about this and making sure that we're all singing off the same page, I think we're going to be safer as a nation. And I appreciate such a distinguished group of folks joining us here today. And with that, I'm going to yield to Mr. Lynch for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Chairman DeSantis as well and all the members of the subcommittee on both sides of the aisle. This is an incredibly important topic, and I appreciate the all-star panel we have here today to help us with our work. I understand that certain questions that might be raised today in this forum are best left for a more secure setting if we're going to get into any detail. And so we know that at the outset. To this end, I appreciate the willingness of our administration witnesses to conduct a classified briefing for committee members at a date to be yet determined. So thank you. As underscored by National Intelligence Director James Clapper in his most recent worldwide threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community, continuous innovation in cyber information technology has been accompanied by the emergency of new and complex national security threats. According to Director Clapper, and this is a quote, "Devices designed and fielded with minimal security requirements and testing and an ever-increasing complexity of networks could lead to widespread vulnerabilities in the civilian infrastructures and the U.S. government systems. These lapses in cybersecurity are highly susceptible to exploitation by a range of threat sources, including foreign governments such as Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, who are motivated by cyber espionage. There's also the threat of cyber terrorism perpetrated by terrorist groups designed to promote online recruitment, propaganda, and financing activity, and cite lone wolf attacks. The Site Intelligence Group reports that the Islamic State actually maintains its own so-called hacking division, or United Cyber Caliphate, a group of prominent hackers that has already published several kill lists of U.S. military personnel online. Moreover, hackers have repeatedly targeted the U.S. commercial sector for illegal monetary gain and money laundering. The continuous onslaught of massive data breaches in the public and private sectors here in the United States and worldwide evidences the complexity, diversity, and far-reaching implications of these cyber attacks. Our national security and cybersecurity framework must be equipped to prevent and mitigate against public sector attacks such as the critical breaches of information technology systems at the Office of Personnel Management back in 2015. These cyber attacks did not only compromise the personal identifiable information of over 22 million individuals, including their Social Security numbers, rather, as noted by the FBI Director James Comey, they also yielded a treasure trove of information about everybody who has worked for, tried to work for, or works for the United States government, close quote. The past 2 years have also witnessed breaches of computer systems at the State Department, the White House, the Internal Revenue Service, and the United States Postal Service, as well as reported leaking of sensitive information pertaining to employees at the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. At the same time, our cybersecurity defenses must be able to deter and respond to threats targeting private sector companies motivated by illicit financial gain. It's my understanding that the Federal Reserve is currently leading other U.S. regulators in developing baseline security safeguards for U.S. banks in the wake of a February 2016 attack in which cyber criminals successfully transferred $81 million out of the Bangladesh Central Bank to a casino in the Philippines. We've also witnessed the infiltration of computer networks at J.P. Morgan Chase that compromised the account information of 83 million households and businesses. A $62 million breach at Home Depot that compromised an estimated 56 million payment cards, and multiple cyber attacks against the Target retail chain that resulted in the theft of approximately 40 million credit and debit card numbers, and the personal information of up to 70 million customers. Clearly, the national security threat posed by cyber attacks is multifaceted and demands the continual development of cybersecurity policies and countermeasures that are adaptable, modernized, and comprehensive. I look forward to discussing with our witnesses at today's hearing what steps we are taking in this regard. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I'd like to thank the ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security for his opening statement. And now I'd like to recognize my friend from the state of Florida, the chairman of the Subcommittee on National Security, Mr. DeSantis, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses. I'm not going to give a full statement in the interest of time. I'd like to hear from the witnesses and get as much done until we have votes, but I will say that this is a very, very important part of our national security challenges and strategy, and it's only going to continue to be something that's more prevalent. So I appreciate the chairman calling the hearing, and I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and I yield back.
You know, one of the areas we all talk about when it comes to national security strategy is the four levers of national security: diplomatic, intelligence, military, and economic. And one of the reasons we composed this panel this way is because of that. And we have DOD here, State Department, thank you, Mr. KANUCK and General Alexander, your previous time in the intelligence community, and now also representing the commercial sector as well. And Mr. Singer, your work in this effort. So I think it's going to be a great conversation, and it is something important that we need to do. And we recognize that the intent is to not get into classified information here, but I think General Alexander said it best in his written statement that without much public discussion, I'm reading from his words, of our basic cyber capabilities, particularly on our offense, we face two major challenges. It's difficult to have a reasoned discussion of how we might respond, at least in the cyber domain, and it is that much harder to deter offensive actions by others. So I think having a public discourse is important in the larger strategy. And what we will do is we're going to recognize General Alexander for your opening remarks, and then we'll have Ranking Member Kelly deliver hers. General Alexander, oh, actually, we got to sign, have everybody, we got to raise the right hand. Yeah. Actually, before we begin, we want to hold the record open for 5 days for members who would like to submit a written statement. And now I'd like to recognize our witnesses. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Aaron Hughes, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber Policy at the U.S. Department of Defense, Mr. Chris Painter, Coordinator for Cyber Issues at the U.S. Department of State, had a long, illustrious career at Department of Justice as well, and White House, NSC, you name it. General Keith Alexander, retired CEO and President. He's retired General, but now CEO and President of IronNet Cybersecurity, a former head of the NSA, ran Cybercom as well. Mr. Sean KANUCK, Counsel at Legal and Strategic Consulting Services and former National Intelligence Officer for Cyber. And Mr. Peter Warren Singer, Strategist and Senior Fellow at New America. Welcome to you all, and pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. So please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Please be seated. And let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. And in order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and your entire written statement will be made as part of the record. General Alexander, you're up first. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, it's an honor and privilege to be here before this committee. I think what you're taking on is vital for our country. And it's also an honor and privilege to be here with my esteemed colleagues from the past. Aaron, I think we've all been together, and Peter and I were on a committee just a few months back. So it's an honor to be here. I'm going to hit mine rather quick. I recognize the classification issues that you raised, Congressman. I know that it's important that we don't raise those in public, but I do think we have to have a debate. I'm not proposing any red lines anywhere I'm proposing that we start the debate in an informed way where you, Congress, the administration, the American people can engage in how we're going to work in cybersecurity. There's been a lot of effort in that area with what my colleagues, Chris and others have done, but I think we have to go further. I'm going to briefly hit the top issues that I see that our government and our country needs to take on, especially when you look at what NATO is doing, now recognizing cyber is a domain of warfare. We need to be out in front. And it reminds me, when Chris was in the Department of Justice back in the 60s, he worked with McNamara. And if you think about McNamara's approach on the nuclear deterrence, can we come up with a strategy for cyber that's equal to that? Congressman Lynch pointed out some great issues that we see every day in cyber, from Home Depot to Target to everything that's going on. Companies are being hammered. We passed legislation recently that helps the companies, commerce, and government work together. It's a step in the right direction, but much more needs to be done. Look at the change in technology, what's going on today, how rapidly this is changing. And if you look at the projections for the Internet of Things by 2020, there'll be 4 to 10 times as many devices on the Internet as there are people on the planet. This is a huge capability and a huge problem. Now when we look at, so what are we going to do about it, think about the threats that Mr. Lynch pointed out. Criminal activities in cyberspace are growing and continue to grow. This year will be, the biggest growth will be in ransomware. I think we're going to see that come out, and this is going to be huge for our companies out there, especially the small and mid-size, who can't afford world-class capabilities. And so it really gets us to a point where we've had in other committee hearings, so what do we do? How does government and industry work together? What's the role of government? What's the role of industry? And how do we share? I'm not going to give you you have to do it this way or this way, but I do think from where you sit in this institution to help start that discussion and create what you think from a congressional oversight you believe needs to be done. Some thoughts on that as we move forward. Who's responsible for defending the nation when we come under attack? If you think about Sony being attacked, Sony has no capability to fire back. In fact, if we think about Sony firing back, we quickly get to the realization that if Sony fires back, that could get us into a war on the Korean Peninsula. We don't want that to happen. That's an inherently government responsibility. If it's a government responsibility, that means government needs to be able to fire back when appropriate, when the administration, the president, and the secretary determine. We can't see the government can't see what's happening to Sony in time to do that. So the first thing is bridging that gap of sharing information between government and industry so that government can do its first job in defending our country. We've got to start that debate. It's been hampered by Snowden and others, but it's something that I think it's important for you and the rest of the administration to take on with our country and with our allies. Second, if we get to a point where our country comes up with the right framework, what would we want to push NATO to set as theirs? And our country developed the Internet. We're the ones who started this. We ought to lead in securing it and coming up with the McNamara approach for how we're going to defend and deter in the same space. And so what I really think we need to do is start that discussion without any preconceived notions about where it will take us, but put the best minds in there and say, here's what we want to do. We want to stop these types of attacks on our industry. We want to ensure that our allies have the same sense and purpose, especially where we have alliances, and that we're all in agreement. And so from my perspective, Mr. Chairman, I'm glad that you've taken this on. I see I'm out of time, so I'll cease work there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, General Alexander. Now it's always a pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague from the great state of Illinois, Ms. Robin Kelly, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on IT.
Thank you, my friend. I'd like to thank Chairman Hurd and Chairman DeSantis for calling this hearing so that the committee and the American people can get a better understanding of when a cyber attack should be considered an act of war and how the United States might respond when that happens. The cyber threats facing the United States are increasing in severity, opening the nation to the possibility of extremely damaging cyber strikes that could potentially threaten the U.S. economy and endanger American lives. General Alexander, in your 2014 testimony before the Senate Committee on Armed Services, you warned, and I quote, "Those attacks are coming, and I think those are near term, and we're not ready for them." In fact, we are already seeing the first salvos of digital attacks reaching beyond the cyber realm. In March of this year, seven members of Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps hacked into the control system of the Bowman Avenue Dam in Rye Brook, New York. In response to the compromise of the dam cyber network, Paul Rosenberg, the village mayor, said, and I quote, "It's ridiculous how little that dam is, how insignificant in the grand scheme of things. We're not talking about something vital to the infrastructure of the country." While May's attack may not have targeted the nation's vital critical infrastructure, it is almost certain that future attacks will. And when that does happen, how do we react? Do we hack the hackers, or do we respond with physical force? This isn't the first time Congress and the intelligence community has tried to answer that question. It is important that we recognize that the global nature of the Internet requires the U.S. to establish solid partnerships throughout the international community so that every nation understands that there are consequences for unacceptable cyber behavior. The problem is that by laying out in a public forum what constitutes unacceptable, we open the possibility that our adversaries know where the tripwires lie across which they can't step. That's why I'm pleased the Chairman has arranged for committee members to receive a classified briefing to better understand where that line is and how we respond when our enemies cross that line. And again, I'd like to thank the Chairman for calling this hearing and our witnesses for being here today.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Now we'll go to Mr. Hughes for your 5 minutes of opening statements.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd and DeSantis, Ranking Members Kelly and Lynch, and members of the subcommittees. I'm pleased to testify today on the Department of Defense's strategy as it relates to cyberspace and how the department approaches cyber incidents. It is an honor to be here, and I'm proud of the progress we have made in this challenging domain. Since DoD's cyber strategy was signed in April of 2015, the department has devoted considerable resources to implementing the goals and objectives outlined within the document. When Secretary Carter signed the strategy, he directed the department to focus its efforts on 3 primary missions in cyberspace. First, to defend DoD networks, systems, and information to assure DoD missions. Second, to defend the United States against cyber attacks of significant consequence, and to provide integrated cyber capabilities in support of military operations and contingency plans. Another key aspect of our strategy is deterrence. DoD is supporting a comprehensive whole-of-government cyber deterrence strategy to deter attacks on U.S. interests. This strategy depends on the totality of U.S. actions to include declaratory policy, overall defensive posture, effective response options, indications and warning capabilities, and the resilience of U.S. networks and systems. That said, incidents described as cyber attacks or computer network attacks are not necessarily armed attacks for the purposes of triggering a nation-state's inherent right of self-defense. When determining whether a cyber incident constitutes an armed attack, the U.S. government considers a broad range of factors, including the nature and extent of injury or death to persons and the destruction of or damage to property. As such, cyber incidents are assessed on a case-by-case basis, and we would use a whole-of-government approach in responding to and deterring future malicious activities in cyberspace. The fact of the matter is that we face diverse and persistent threats in cyberspace from state and non-state actors that cannot be defeated through the efforts of any single organization. Our increasingly wired and interconnected world has brought prosperity and economic gain to the United States, while our dependence on these systems have left us vulnerable to the evolving threats posed by malicious cyber activity. While DoD maintains and uses robust and unique cyber capabilities to defend our networks and the nation, that alone is not sufficient. Securing our systems and networks is everyone's responsibility and requires close collaboration with other federal departments, our allies and partners internationally, and the private sector to improve our nation's cybersecurity posture and to ensure that DoD has the ability to operate in any environment at any time. The Department is committed to enhancing the resilience of our networks and systems and defending the U.S. homeland and U.S. interests from attacks of significant consequence that may occur in cyberspace. And I look forward to working with these committees and the Congress to ensure that DoD has the necessary capabilities to carry out our roles and missions in cyberspace and to keep our country safe. I thank you for the support in these efforts, and I look forward to your questions this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Ms. Painter, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Hurd and DeSantis, Ranking Member Kelly and Lynch, members of the Subcommittee for Information Technology and National Security, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I will discuss the framework for stability in cyberspace that the State Department in particular is working to promote internationally, but with our partners. I will also cover some of the other topics that were raised in your invitation. The Department of State, working with our interagency partners, is guided by the President's 2011 International Strategy for Cyberspace, which sets out a strategic framework of international cyber stability designed to achieve and maintain a peaceful cyberspace environment where all states are able to fully realize its benefits, where the advantages to cooperating against common threats and avoiding conflict, where there are advantages, and where there is little incentive for states to engage in disruptive behavior or to attack one another. This framework has three key elements. First, the affirmation that existing international law applies to state behavior in cyberspace. Second, the development of an international consensus and promotion of additional voluntary norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace that apply during peacetime. And third, the development and implementation of practical confidence-building measures, or CBMs, among states. Although many of the elements of this framework may seem self-evident to a U.S. audience, especially a sophisticated one, cyber issues are still new to many states, and there are also states that hold alternative views of how to promote cyber stability. Notwithstanding these headwinds, as well as the fact that diplomatic negotiations on other issues can take many years, if not decades, the United States and its partners have made substantial and really big progress in recent years toward advancing our strategic framework for international cyber stability. Since 2009, the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts on International Security Issues in Cyberspace, or the UNGGE, has served as a productive and groundbreaking expert-level venue for the United States to build support for this framework through three consensus reports in 2010, 2013, and 2015. I should emphasize the U.S. has been the leader here. The conclusions captured in those reports have in turn been endorsed by political leaders in a range of settings, including most recently at the G20 Leaders Summit in Turkey. Given the title of this hearing, Digital Acts of War, I would like to discuss how the U.S. government thinks about these issues, which is consistent with its broader approach to promoting stability in cyberspace through the prism of existing international law. As an initial matter, the United States has been clear that it believes that cyber activities may, in certain circumstances, constitute an armed attack that triggers our inherent right to self-defense as recognized by Article 51 of the UN Charter. The United States has described publicly how it would evaluate whether a cyber activity constitutes an armed attack under international law. Of primary importance to such a determination are the actual or anticipated effects of a particular incident. When determining whether a cyber activity constitutes an armed attack sufficient to trigger a state's inherent right to self-defense, the U.S. government believes that states should consider the nature and extent of the injury or death to persons and the destruction of or damage to property, an effects-based test. It is worth emphasizing that this is a case-by-case, fact-specific inquiry, whether the events in question occur in cyberspace or elsewhere. As a general matter, states have not sought to define precisely or state conclusively what situations would constitute armed attacks in other domains, and there is no reason cyberspace should be different. In fact, strategic ambiguity could very well deter most states from getting close to the threshold of an armed attack. Finally, I would hasten to note that regardless of whether a particular incident rises to the level of an armed attack, we have a range of options for responding. The U.S. government uses a whole-of-government approach to responding to and deterring malicious activities in cyberspace that brings to bear its full range of instruments of national power and corresponding policy tools: diplomatic, law enforcement, economic, military, and intelligence as appropriate and consistent with applicable law in particular cases. As suggested in the invitation for this hearing, public attribution is one such option. In cases where actors responsible for a particular incident have been determined, the U.S. government will consider whether to identify those actors publicly when we believe it will further our national interest, including our ability to hold those actors accountable. However, the U.S. government will also maintain flexibility to avail itself of the full suite of options that we have. In closing, I would like to thank the two subcommittees for giving me an opportunity to speak on such a relevant and timely set of issues. Despite the threats we face in cyberspace, I know that we were all committed to maintaining and promoting an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable Internet in the face of these threats that we can all continue to benefit from. On a personal note, I've been involved in these issues, as the Chairman has mentioned, for the last 24 years now, almost 25. And I'm very pleased to see that they are getting the attention as a policy priority both within the U.S. and around the world. And I certainly think we've made a lot of progress in having the kind of conversation that was discussed earlier, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Painter. Mr. KANUCK, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Hurd, Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, Ranking Member Kelly, and distinguished members of Congress. It is indeed a pleasure to be here and contribute to this important discussion. Having looked at it as an academic, as a professional international attorney, and as the National Intelligence Officer for 5 years until last May, I come with a genuinely strategic and analytic approach. I have not been involved in policy formulation directly in the past. And I concur with my colleagues about the importance of this topic, and after 15, 20 years of my own experience, I too am excited to see the public and congressional attention being paid to this important issue. I will offer, however, that as a nation, we still lack both a strategic approach to this problem and a practical, effective set of solutions to deter malicious and adversarial behavior in cyberspace. And that itself is illustrated by the myriad cyber attacks we read about each year that are perpetrated by a range of state and non-state actors. In my written testimony, I addressed several of the questions that my colleagues have also mentioned, so let me very briefly say that I concur with Mr. Hughes and Mr. Painter that digital acts of war will be judged through an effects-based analysis. In my academic work since 1996, I've held that position, and I do agree with the U.S. government representatives here today that that is the correct approach. Regarding the issue of attribution challenges, I will note in my analytic work for the intelligence community, we looked at two considerations. We looked at the technical or forensic aspects, network investigations, malicious software, reverse engineering, and other digital footprints, in addition to what I termed analytic attribution, where you looked at the geopolitical context within which malicious cyber events happened. In many cases, the context, the identity of the target, and how the information that was stolen, compromised, or made unavailable is used or leveraged can oftentimes tell you about the motivation and possibly the actor. That's from the analytic and technical attribution side. A completely distinct question is whether or not one would seek to do public attribution, and that is inherently a policy question for policymakers. It has three components, in my opinion. There's the question about the bilateral relationship with any entity you may accuse of an action. Cyber does not occur in its own stovepipe or domain. It's a part of a much larger international and bilateral relationships. Secondly, the decision of whether or not to compromise sources and methods of intelligence in order to prove evidentiary why that attribution assessment is being offered publicly. Obviously, there would be policy reasons to not disclose certain intelligence capabilities, especially in a context where those capabilities may be perishable and they may be the exact same platforms or accesses that one may use for a retaliatory capability. So it's almost a double negative potential if you choose to publicly attribute in that context, because you don't have separate reconnaissance platforms in all cases and separate retaliatory platforms the way you would have had in a nuclear context, for example. Last of all, as I believe Ranking Member Kelly may have mentioned, the issue of credible threats and credible deterrence. If you are not prepared or capable of exacting satisfaction upon accusing or attributing an action to someone, what does that do for your global reputation and the import of any of your declaratory statements? Those three very important policy questions
are very distinct from the technical attribution questions, but equally important from a policy perspective. I will also commend the U.S. diplomats who have had what I think are great successes in the UN Group of Governmental Experts, the G20, OSCE, and with particularly President Xi and the People's Republic of China. However, I am not personally convinced that diplomatic overtures directly translate into changes of behavior, particularly when Western countries like the United States continue to have fundamentally different objectives for international cybersecurity than certain other nations, such as Russia and China, and my written statement addresses some of that basal difference. I will also offer that I see a de facto norm today, which is do cyber operations, do them clandestinely, and try to get away with them, you might not be punished. And in fact, Director Clapper's testimony in 2016 read, "Many actors remain undeterred from conducting reconnaissance, espionage, and even attacks in cyberspace because of the relatively low costs of entry, the perceived payoff, and the lack of significant consequences." My time is concluded, so I will leave that there for now. Thank you very much, and once again, thank you for the invitation to participate.
Thank you, Mr. KANUCK. Mr. Singer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, ranking members, and members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to speak at this important discussion today designed to reboot the cybersecurity conversation. This shift is direly needed as there is perhaps no national security problem more 21st century in its definition and form than cybersecurity, and yet to solve it, too much of our discussion and strategy remains rooted in 20th century frameworks that don't well apply. I've submitted written testimony that breaks down the issue and what we can do about it. It focuses on the debate over digital acts of war and explains in detail how there are 7 key differences with the Cold War that make framing this problem in the old modes not ideal. It then provides a suggested new legislative strategy to face our challenge, breaking it down into key areas I'll focus on today. Notably, the strategy is nonpartisan, realistic in its implementation possibilities, and doesn't involve any massive increase in budget. The first key part of the strategy is deter through diversity. This includes improving our offensive cyber capability, but importantly, understanding that cyber weapons are not like WMD. They are tools of constant use in everything from espionage to ongoing operations against ISIS. Our real challenge here is more in integrating emerging cyber capabilities with our other conventional capabilities through improving training, doctrine building, resolving command and control questions. But as we face an array of attacks and attackers, a military offensive cyber response is not the only tool that we have to change their calculations. For instance, to respond to IP theft, it makes no sense to limit ourselves to retaliation with the exact same action in the same domain. We can also go after other assets that are valued by the attacker in other realms, and even those valued by influential third-party actors, such as sanctioning companies benefiting from stolen fruit. Indictments of individuals involved in hacking have value not so much in actual direct judicial punishment, but as a different means for surfacing data about attribution. Creativity and flexibility will beat simplicity in this dynamic. Indeed, we may even steal ideas from one attacker's playbook and apply them against another as a deterrence tool. From Snowden to Sony, data dumps have been among our most vexing cybersecurity incidents, but they have not threatened our core national interests. By contrast, threatening to reveal the private financial data of an authoritarian regime's leader, his family, or allied oligarchs may be far more potent than a counter cyber strike. We can sometimes see what regimes fear most by what they ban discussion of. The second and arguably most important part of the strategy is deterrence by denial, making attacks less likely to cause harm and thus less likely to happen. The magic word of resilience is that it works against any kind of attacker and attack, and is perhaps where Congress and this committee can have the most impact. The areas that call out for action cover the spectrum. On the military side, we have spent over $2 billion on construction alone at Fort Meade, and yet the Pentagon's own weapons tester found, quote, significant vulnerabilities, end quote, in nearly every major weapons system program that would be exploited in any actual war. In the executive branch, the White House has issued a post-OPM cybersecurity strategy that describes best practices every federal agency needs to put into place. ensuring their actual implementation at every federal government agency, and encouraging their spread to the state and local level could be one of the most important things that Congress does on cybersecurity. In relation to the business and public, sometimes government can be a trusted information provider, and sometimes it must go further to help shape individual and market incentives, as it has in realms that range from public health to transportation. The government should not merely support research on basic standards of Internet security, such as the laudable NIST process, but now work to ensure their use. It can do so by efforts to spur the nascent cybersecurity insurance market that both protects business and incentivizes them to find and maintain best practices. True cybersecurity resilience is not just about computer and legal code, it's also about people, and we have a huge people gap here. The administration has a new cybersecurity human resources strategy, but it needs to, 1, be overseen to ensure actual implementation, particularly across administrations, and 2, it will fail if it only puts new people in old organizational boxes. We also have to find ways to tap talent outside of government. Take the Pentagon's recent one-month experiment with bug bounties. It saved millions of dollars, yielded 1,100 reports on how to protect our systems before the bad guys could attack them, and it talent scouted across the U.S. One of the hackers working for us was an 18-year-old who did it in his spare time while taking his AP exams. Yet there is not a parallel at other federal agencies, nor at our state and local partners. Or consider that we have retasked a number of National Guard units to become cyber warriors, but there is a wealth of talent that is either unwilling or unable to meet the legal and physical obligations that come with joining the U.S. military. Here I would point to Estonia's Cyber Defense League as a model to draw on. Think of it as the cybersecurity equivalent to the Civil Air Patrol, creating a mechanism for citizens to volunteer their expertise for cybersecurity to aid for free in everything from red teaming to serving as rapid response teams to cyber attack. They've helped Estonia become one of the most cyber resilient nations in the world. The third rail of the strategy I won't hit, which is norms. It's in the submission. I think it's been covered well here. I would end just simply by saying we can either approach this topic with a new strategy that faces our new needs, or we can continue to talk tough and simple and be victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Singer. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. DeSantis for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Alexander, how do you view the distinction, if you think there's one, between the threat from state-sanctioned cyber attacks versus non-state actors who are trying to attack us in cyberspace?
I would not make a distinction based on the impact to our nation. And I think that's an extremely important question you bring out, because it really says what's the role of government in protecting this country. And it doesn't matter who takes down the financial sector, the energy sector, the healthcare sector. If it goes down, that's critical to our nation. So the consequence and the approach and our strategy has to discuss both. We learned that in 9/11. While there may not be direct ties to this or direct linkage back, I think that's the approach that we should take, look at what the impact of the nation would be.
And I agree with that in terms of trying to prevent that. How, though, if there is a successful attack, how do you then respond when, if there are in fact non-state actors who are responsible? After 9/11, I think it's actually a good framework to think about it. The policy was, look, if you're a state actor, you may not have committed the attack, but if you're harboring terrorists who are doing it, we're going to hold you liable. Does that same framework, will that work in cyberspace? Because it would seem to be difficult that a government would be able to have a handle on everybody who's operating in cyberspace.
Right. So you've asked a great question in that, because it also gets you back to our strategy. And the strategy can't be, what are we going to do after an attack? It's really what you're hitting on is we can't afford to allow that kind of attack to occur. And so what it really does is it says we're going to shape our strategy on preventing, not on forensics. Now, forensics are important, and we do have to go through, but if everything is based on after-the-fact forensics, then you've already lost something, and what you're really getting to is we need a defensive strategy that stops that from happening. And I would take it one step further. You know, we look at the theft of intellectual property, the greatest transfer of wealth in history. That's taking our future away from us. How do we defend against that? And I believe that's where government and industry need to work together. I like Peter's approach about working together with industry. We need to make a more secure cyberspace. And all the roles that we can put in with state, with DOD, but it has to be a linkage to the commercial side. They own the vast majority of the networks.
Mr. KANUCK, you talked about how people in cyberspace could be doing espionage, typical things that governments do. They can also be doing it, which would be considered more of an attack along the lines of an act of war. So the fact that, so do we have the forensic ability to determine whether a particular measure was meant or compromise was an attack versus a form of espionage, and how does that impact our ability to calibrate our response?
In response to particular incidents, they are usually ad hoc investigations dealing with the particular circumstances. It is very difficult to divine the intentions of would-be adversaries or actors in specific instances. Often you might derive that information from other sources of information, intelligence collection, other areas, to know what actors' objectives may have been. Simply looking from the forensic data, if you are able to see what was exfiltrated and where it went and how it was later used, that may give you a sense of the objectives. I will simply offer that in the real-time context of an ongoing incident, where you would want to be responding in a policy or military sense in real time, that will be a very high challenge for real-time attribution and to motivation as well. If you are permitting policy responses days, weeks, months later, when you do have a higher degree of attribution, that may be possible, but it is not a certainty that you always know who did it and why.
Great. Mr. Singer, we're hearing more about non-state actors, terrorist groups, criminal groups using sophisticated toolkits to launch cyber attacks. So first of all, are sophisticated cyber capabilities finding their way to less sophisticated actors? Are we seeing evidence of that?
Yes, they are. They proliferate. However, I think we still need to recognize that states are the big dog in this, both because of their higher technical capability. So there's, for example, ISIS was mentioned, lethal group in lots of different ways, but their cyber capability pales compared to a China or a Russia. The second is the scale that a state can bring to the problem. So it's not just sophistication, it's the ability to mobilize thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of people in the community if you are carrying out an attack. States are a fundamentally different challenge here than non-state actors. Fortunately, on the good side, states have interests, and so they can be deterred in a different way that many non-state actors can't, so we shouldn't bundle them together.
Thanks. My time has expired, and I yield back.
General Alexander, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would recommend, based on what Chairman DeSantis brought up, that the committee might consider getting a briefing or a demonstration of the dark web. It answers the question that you were just asking: what's available for hackers out there? What do they do to buy it, and how are they getting their materials? And there are companies that have some of these demonstrations that I think you would find extremely informative on just that question: how is it proliferating?
Thank you, General. And we're going to recognize Ms. Kelly for her 5 minutes of questions, and then we'll go into recess for votes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Singer, in a December 2015 article for Foreign Policy Magazine's website, you said that government strategies for responding to cyber threats is based on assumptions and plans made for the Cold War threats that are 30, 40, 50 years old. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Deputy Assistant Secretary Hughes, during the Cold War, our strategy of mutually assured destruction was based on the fact that we could tell instantly if the Soviets fired an intercontinental missile. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is it equally obvious to figure out where a cyber attack originates?
I think, as Mr. KANUCK said, there's many factors that go into that attribution and determination. So I'd say it is probably not as instantaneous as it was during the Cold War.
And why do you think that is? Just because there are so many factors, or do you feel like
Number of factors, there's number of actors, diverse operators out on the internet makes it extremely difficult.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Singer, unlike during the Cold War, you said when considering responses to a cyber attack, and I quote, the defender's best move may well not be to strike back as rapidly as possible, but to show no outside awareness of the ongoing attack. Deputy Assistant Secretary Hughes, why might the U.S. choose not to respond to a cyber attack?
I mean, I think it goes to a point that my colleague, Mr. Painter, made in terms of what our response might be. I think there's a number of factors from foreign policy implications and the like that we want to make a determination on response on a case-by-case basis.
So the main question of this hearing is, when do we strike back against an adversary for a malicious cyber attack? Taking it one step further, when do we respond with not just a cyber attack of our own, but possibly missiles and tanks? Mr. Singer, you said that we need to think differently about our response to cyber attacks, and I was trying to write down everything you said. You talked about deter through diversity, sanctions, indictments, being creative and flexible, maybe revealing finances of our enemy, and any other strategies you want to add. You talked about HR and talents to bring aboard.
There's a whole series of things, but I think the key here is to recognize when we're talking about the attacks, there is a wide array of them. So the attack on us might be anything from intellectual property theft to espionage, stealing of a state secret, to our feared scenario of something that causes mass loss of life. The first two traditionally have not been defined as acts of war. The third may meet that definition. And then in no way, shape, or form would we want to limit ourselves to a merely cyber response to it. We would want to have all the tools there. The other issue of here is the timing. Part of why you may choose to delay your response is not just the normative questions, it's to complicate the attacker's job. If you know that they're inside your system, you can then observe them, steer them into areas where they can't cause harm. The bottom line here is that we're going to need a very creative and diverse strategy, and the old kind of Cold War model of, whacking back if they hack us just won't be successful. It won't deliver actual cyber security.
Thank you. Mr. Hughes and Mr. Painter, how do you respond?
I'd say a couple things. First of all, and this also goes to Chairman DeSantis' question, we do have a range of tools in our toolkit. So yes, hacking or using cyber offensive operations could be one. Using kinetic operations may be another, depending on what the incidence is. We've said in our international strategy in cyberspace back in 2011, we have the full range of tools we'll use if the incident is significant enough, including diplomatic, including economic, including cyber tools, including kinetic tools in appropriate circumstances. We'll try to exhaust the law enforcement and network security tools first. I also quite agree that part of this is, and I'd push back against the view that we are looking at this from a nuclear perspective or one that's from 50 years ago. I think one of the things we've been doing and spending a lot of time on is looking at this whole of government approach where we're really looking at new capabilities, new tools, making sure we're inculcating this throughout, not just our government, but NATO was mentioned, making sure that NATO has this as part of their strategic concept, making sure that other countries understand this and we have more of a collective defense. That's exactly what we're trying to do. And when you're talking about a criminal threat, I agree with General Alexander that it's not, you look at the effects are going to might be the same, but the tools you use to respond might be different. If it's a nation state, you have certain tools. If it's a criminal group, you might be using law enforcement investigatory tools.
Do you have anything much different? Because my time is running out. Is there anything else?
No, I think Chris hit it right on the head. There's a diverse way that we can respond, and we need to bring all those to bear for each event.
Thank you.
So votes have been called, so the chair is going to declare a recess until immediately following the last vote.